I think we'll get started, everyone. Yeah. We'll get started, everyone. How about that? So firstly, I'd like to welcome councillors and staff to this information session, which is to discuss the Town of Gawler's 2024-25 recurrent budget. I'll open tonight's proceeding with a statement of acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge this land that we gather on tonight is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. This session will be used solely for the purpose of information sharing and not for the purpose of debating issues, building consensus positions, or otherwise discharging council's deliberative and decision-making functions. There's no set agenda and no minutes will be taken during this session. If people can turn their phones to silent, and if you need to take a phone call, please take it outside. Is this being live streamed? How do we know? How do I know? I can't tell. I can't tell. No, you don't need to put that on. Okay, so if anyone's watching tonight, we will be discussing the recurrent budget 224-225. It will be facilitated by Sharon Perkins, Executive Manager, Finance and Corporate Governance. We will not be going into confidence, so this will be a live streamed, so you can watch from beginning to the end. Thank you. And I hope people enjoy our discussion around the recurrent budget. And I'll hand over to Sharon Perkins. Yeah.
Thanks, Mayor. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming along. Just a bit of a precursor. If anyone's expecting lots of numbers tonight, there aren't a lot of numbers tonight. The way I'm going to frame this discussion is in relation to, I suppose, making sure that forming the relationship between the recurrent budget and the long-term financial plan. So this financial year, we actually, by November, we have to actually adopt a new long-term financial plan as well. And the 24-25 budget is actually is the basis for that. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to go through which sort of makes reference to the long-term financial plan and forward years. And the idea of that is actually just to show how the linkages between those two documents are, and what the impact potentially that you have of decisions that you make today will actually impact what actually happens in the future. So to start off with, some of this stuff is probably, you've heard me talk about it before, and there is going to be a continual repeat of the same themes as we actually go through. Obviously, with the long-term financial plan and our budget and every budget that we set, the underlying principle should actually be financial sustainability. And that means basically making sure that all our services, our programs, our facilities, our capital programs and our standard of service is actually delivered with regard to, and we are adequately funded, without actually making sure that we have any peaks and troughs or movements, deviations in our rate increase. What we actually want to do is make sure that, from a community perspective, they understand that their rates are actually going to go up each year, but the rates are actually reasonable and consistent, so nothing sort of comes out of the blue. The other two factors that have been taken into account as well in some of the information that I'm going to present tonight is the Audit and Risk Committee recommendations. As you're aware, as part of the 23-24 budget, their recommendation to the council was to in reviewing the long-term financial plan, making sure that we have financial strategies to actually return our operating budget to a surplus position within 3 years. And then just recently, as part of the last audit committee, and you haven't actually seen this recommendation yet because the audit committee meeting was only a week or so ago, was that effectively that the 24-25 budget forms a foundation with the view to actually become back into an operating surplus position for the 25-26 financial year. I will sit there and say that's a fairly audacious goal. It's a very big stretch target given our current financial position. However, as we've gone through the budget from an administration perspective, we've actually taken that into account, and that is pretty much what we're still driving to do, is to position this budget so that we can be as close as possible to a operating or at least a break-even position for the 25-26 financial year. And that will actually form the basis of the financial strategy that we actually set out in the long-term financial plan going forward as well. This is a bit of from our session that we actually had back in November, some of the challenges that we're actually faced with. Obviously, we've got some underlying operating deficits in our recurrent operations, so that's actually what the key is to. The key to getting back into a financially sustainable position is making sure that at least in our recurrent operations, at a bare minimum, we're actually delivering an operating surplus. So we have been delivering operating deficits from our recurrent position for the last few years, and we actually budgeted for one as part of the 23-24. So that's really what we need to actually focus on that. Because realistically, if we actually don't start putting that focus on making sure that we've actually got a operating surplus in our recurrent operations, what we actually have to do then is to sit there and that will start impacting on, I suppose, our service standard and our service level and the services that we actually can provide to the community. We're a growth council and part of a growth region, so that actually does put pressure on us. It puts pressure on us within the council area, but it also adds pressure from the growth that's actually happening with the region, which is close to our boundary, and some of that growth actually happening in fair distance away from, I suppose, the service centres of those respective councils that that growth is actually happening. Because human nature, people will actually take the shortest distance, you know, and Gawler is really a service centre, so effectively they'll be utilising us, our town, our facilities, without necessarily making a contribution to it unless they're utilising user fee or user pay services. And the other factor from a growth council is the fact that we're actually getting a lot of assets contributed to us, which we actually have to ensure that we maintain and renew going forward. Again, access to funds. We are relying on a cash advance facility to fund our operations. We have no cash reserves. We are reaching our borrowing limit of $25 million. And based on current forecasts in relation to the long-term financial plan, that debt ceiling will actually be reached from the 24-25 financial year. That doesn't mean that as a council we wouldn't be able to access funds that we need to operate through increase in facilities. However, our debt provider will be putting covenants on us, and those covenants will actually be the fact that we actually stick to our long-term financial plan, that we have to start delivering operating surpluses, we have to deliver on our asset management plan, and if we want to actually do something that's outside of our asset management plan or outside of our long-term financial plan, we're actually going to have to go back to them to get approval. You know, so the destiny of what you're actually delivering and when you're delivering it and all that sort of stuff essentially gets taken out of our hands, and the sense that the funder will have more say in what and when you're doing it. So we are actually having a presentation next week. I think it's next Thursday. Next Wednesday, with the LGFA, so representatives from LGFA, who are our funders, will actually come out and give an overview. So this is part of your training program and your refresher program on how LGFA looks at councils when it comes to determine whether we're actually going to lend money. So I recommend that you all attend that information session. From an asset management perspective, it's balancing that renewal spend. We all know that there's a bit of a backlog of our asset renewals, so making sure that we balance that renewal spend, but also, I suppose, providing that opportunity to actually get some new and upgrade assets as well alongside of that. And again, we're talking about the contributed assets. And now I think all councils, it's meeting that community needs and expectations. You know, I think that probably over the last 5 years, I think the expectations of communities is that they want everything bright and shiny and all that sort of stuff, and that's across all council areas. And it's balancing those needs with actually what we can afford without increasing rates or increasing that burden on the community. So there are hard decisions to be made. We have to, how can we minimise our deficit, from the 24-25 onwards, and this is, I've just pulled this slide out from the previous presentation that I provided to you back in November, but realistically, how can we provide surpluses from 25-26? That's only 12 months away. It is a very short time frame, and how we can reduce our operating overdraft facilities. So we actually do have the access to funds, so we don't have to increase our debt ceiling, so we don't have to actually be stuck with those debt covenants and having the bank decide when and where we're going to do things for our community. And fundamentally how we are going to become financially sustainable and bringing our financial risk back within appetite. So they are that's a very challenging task, and I do use we as a collective we, so I think it is a concerted effort between the administration and the council members as well. It's not either the administration's task or it's not the council members' task or the elected member bodies. It's basically us together, working together and working out how we can actually do this with and still be able to deliver what the community wants and expects, and without actually having to cut services or increase rates. This is just basically so this is the long-term financial plan. So it has had a few tweaks in it since it was presented in November. So that's just basically just some changes and some minor assumptions. But this is where it is to sit there and say, so the long-term financial plan sits there and says that from a recurrent operating surplus for this year, it's actually going to be a deficit of around $1 million. And then from a recurrent perspective, we start coming into a surplus position. However, that actually gets eroded by the fact of the new initiatives and some cyclical expenditure, and where the plan's budgeted for around about $500,000 a year in new initiatives. So, and when I talk about new initiatives, they can be things like, effectively, they might be legislative impacts. They might be, for example, every 4 years we actually go through a local government election. So in 26, 27, we'll actually have an increase in our budget, which we're treating as a new initiative because it's not an underlying operating activity in our recurrent operations, because it only happens every 4 years. But we're required to fund that. So in that year, so you will see 26, 27, the operating initiatives budget sort of is $800,000. $160,000 of that is actually just to our contribution to the local government election. We also might have things in relation to plans, like, you know, there's a lot of legislative plans that we have in place. We have the Dog and Cat Management Act, we have the Disability and Inclusion and Access Plan, which are legislative plans that basically by legislation we have to review every 4 years. So there's those cyclical expenses. And then obviously out of all those plans there's actions that we actually have to deliver, and they will actually be potentially, so we need some funding to actually deliver on those plans as well. So we're treating those as new initiatives. So on top of our recurrent operating surplus, or we have to actually fund those activities as well. So realistically, so at the moment, over that four-year period, to bring it back to a surplus in 25, 26, essentially we're probably trying to look for $4 million. And then we'll be basically square, you know, so that isn't actually even delivering an operating surplus. So it's a $5 million turnaround, which is as I said, it's a very big task. It's a very audacious goal that I suppose the Audit Committee has recommended to the Council, but I think even from a Council perspective, I think it should actually be our goal without even having that recommendation, because we actually also want to be financially sustainable. We want to actually deliver on some of the big ticket programs, because these forecasts don't even actually include some of the big ticket strategic projects that we're actually been talking about. This is just basically the what's in the asset management plans and our normal recurrent operations. So we want to make sure that we can have some operating surpluses so we can actually pay down that borrowings. That borrowings figure gets really big really quickly. And that's just a combination, that's just a cumulative impact of the past, where we've actually been having operating deficits, and we're needing to literally borrow funds to actually provide for the normal day-to-day services. One of the things that we did as an executive group, so we sort of had a planning session last week that effectively said, okay, well, this is a big challenge that we've actually got ahead of ourselves. What do we actually need to do? So we've got a big challenge in setting the budget, but we've also got a big challenge in setting and returning, I suppose, presenting a good long-term financial plan that has the capacity to do all the things that we've been talking about over the last, I suppose, 12 to 18 months that I've been here. So we've sort of broken it down into 4 main areas where we thought for a future vision of what we actually need to do to, I suppose, deliver on the things that we've been talking about. Or the things that we actually need to work to. So in this budget, how can we set a budget to actually create that surplus or create that fund or create that cash so we can actually future-proof our sport and recreation? So making sure the town can meet the sport and recreational needs of the community, and probably also the surrounding suburbs that are actually being built along our borders boundary. Activating our business precinct, so that's making sure that we've actually got a prosperous local economy. So that's more than just the main street. So we've got multiple business precincts. So it's making sure that they're all generating and creating, I suppose, that activity and that activation in the town. Managing the infrastructure to meet the growth. So making sure that we're being proactive for future growth, but we're actually meeting that growth and the infrastructure needs from a community infrastructure and a civil infrastructure. So that's our road paths, footpaths, curbs, playgrounds, open space areas when I talk about the community and civil infrastructure. And it actually provides a connected and accessible integrated community. So making sure that we're not necessarily chasing our tails, we're not doing it too early, but we're actually doing it in a planned manner that effectively we can meet that. And then obviously meeting the expanding regional demand. You know, you just have to walk along, go down the expressway to look at how much extra housing's being built along around our boundaries. You know, we've got a whole heap of extra stuff that's actually happening out at Light, in Playford, and we know that we've got Concordia coming up as well. So, and we're probably the closest service centre to some of those housings, that new growth, and making sure that we're actually got the capacity to meet that and that demand as well, without putting too much pressure on our existing facilities. So that's what we've come up with. Again, you know, this isn't set in stone. This is just us getting together and working out, okay, well, how can we actually attack what we actually need to do? And just in relation to that, and then I suppose, what I would call strategic projects, we actually went through and worked out, you know, what are the proposed projects and initiatives that have been talked about, either in this last council term or even before in the previous council term, about things that we're actually needing to plan for. So we're actually in a position to actually deliver them. Because we can do lots of planning, but we actually also have to construct. We have to deliver on it, and that's where the pressure is actually happening, in the sense of, at the moment, we don't really have the financial capacity to actually deliver on these projects. So within the future-proofing the sport and recreation, there's things like the Southern Sporting Precinct, the Elliot Goodger redevelopment, the pool redevelopment and upgrade, the Gawler Showgrounds, Carbeatham Reserve redevelopment stage 2. So that's not an exhaustive list, but they're some of the things that we've been talking about. In activating the business precinct, it's the urban design framework and delivering and enhancing that. 12th Street streetscape upgrades, Main North Road, Williston upgrades, and car parking deck, and then the Pioneer Wall and the Heritage Wall for the council owned, about making sure that they're... and then you probably add in Churchill and any work or anything from Churchill. So, you know, it's just activating the business precinct and doing the things that effectively make people want to come to Gawler, make people want to invest in Gawler going forward. Managing infrastructure growth. So this is just basically, you know, meeting the development of the development-led or the developer-led traffic and community infrastructure interventions. We know that we've got into deeds with the major developers, that we actually have some infrastructure that we are committed to, not necessarily 100% deliver, but we actually have a funding contribution to that. The Works Depot redevelopment, addressing our civil infrastructure renewal backlog, making sure that we can still deliver on our asset management plans, because we know that effectively there's going to be some financial cost pressures on that, because there is, you know, we've had cost increases and our unit prices are actually going up. Yes, they're not going up as much as they used to, but I don't think that they're actually going back to the previous, like, pre-COVID levels. You know, we've got a new base level that we need to actually accommodate. And then obviously anything that comes out of the growth and the integrated transport strategy, which we're actually doing this year as well, you know, managing for those impacts to make sure that we do have that, I suppose, that integrated and connected transport network. And then meeting the expanding regional demand. So obviously we're a member council of the Gawler River Floodplain Management Authority, so meeting the requirements for the flood mitigation works across the region. We've got southern rural areas, the boundary realignment, and then even there might be something from that, from the growth framework, and obviously waterproofing Gawler. So those are some of the things that we're talking about that effectively we know that we've got it in the future. We don't have the financial capacity to do all these all at once. So we're going to have to actually plan for this over the next, next 10, 15, 20 years, and making sure, but the critical thing that we have to do from a budget perspective, which starts with the 24-25 budget, is returning and creating that financial sustainability so we can actually meet this, because we have the borrowing capacity and from that perspective. So I've been talking about the financial strategy of what the long-term financial plan is and what our financial strategy is, and the financial strategy is more than just paying down debt and so we can actually do for the next project, because that actually doesn't necessarily create a sustainable operations, because what you tend to do, if you take that mentality of, okay, well, I'm reducing expenditure for the next 3 years, so I've got enough money to do a major project, all you're doing is basically kicking some essential services and essential renewal works literally down the road, and because you're going to have to actually fund them at the same time. So the idea is to sit there and say, okay, well, what can we do over the next 3 years? And I'll use a term of sitting there saying, okay, well, for the remainder of this term, we're sitting there saying we think that we just need to go back to basics. We actually just need to do back to the basics. We need to focus on our renewals, focus on getting that renewal program and our infrastructure, our existing infrastructure up to scratch, addressing some of the issues in relation to the areas of upgrading footpaths from unformed footpaths to formed footpaths, and unformed roads to bitumised roads and our road shoulders and all that sort of stuff. So it's basically doing that, getting back to, I suppose, the core business, what traditionally has been the core business of council. And coupled with that is that we know that we've got some developer-led interventions that we have to actually fund. We've budgeted for Carlton Road roundabout in the 23-24 budget, and we know that there's a couple of other interventions that are due that we have to actually contribute to. We are doing some work in relation to resetting those deeds, but it's not actually reducing our commitment. It's just making sure that we're actually all aware of what commitments were required and when. So we will have some commitments with regard to Gawler East and the southern urban areas. And then over the next 3 years, rather than actually delivering on any strategic projects, it's just making sure that we're doing all that planning, so we're well planned, so we actually know what we're doing, when we're doing it, and how we're actually going to deliver it and then for the next council term, then we'll actually do the design and detailed design and construction of those key projects that we've selected or earmarked as a priority for the planning that's actually happening in the next 3 years, and subsequent to that, in that 4-year planning for the next 4 years. So this is the approach that we thought is probably a way chunking it down into sit there and say, okay, well let's chunk it down. We've got a 10-year plan, but let's chunk it down to I suppose 4-year areas, in the sense of saying, okay, well, so we can set what we can do in 4 years and plan for what we're going to do in the next 4 years. So it's what can we deliver in those 4-year periods, rather than thinking that we can deliver everything, because we know that we can't. Does anyone have any questions? Nathan, you can. Should be free.
Thank you. Firstly, sorry, Mayor, I was meant to pass on Jim's apology. I was working with him on a building matter and he said, can you pass on my apology? So just take that as that. Firstly, thank you for the presentation, the opportunity to ask some questions. I guess when we're talking about growth councils, services and the like, I don't disagree that there is a geographical location that we benefit from in a business precinct, but there would be some spillover in relation to those customers coming in. When we do make the comment though, in relation to Growth Council, and then you go back to track our actuals, some of those revenue ins don't seem to be aligning with a Growth Council. I noticed that you did say regional growth, and that's obviously pointing out the revenue. But when we start trying to, lacking in the revenue, of the neighbouring council land, when we're talking about the increased service levels, what are we talking about factually in actual dollars per year in what we're able to track? You know, Roseworthy, for example, is a development that's going ahead. There's a massive education precinct and Newtown Centre going in there as well. But I think you're talking about the potential of people coming over the border using our roads, footpaths, but then using our private-owned services because they can't do any town planning and the like, so it's not a council service. They might come in and use the pool, so yes. So I guess just if I was to talk about dollars and I was to try to ask the actual cost in effect, is that something you'd be able to break down, or is it just a feeling? Because when you read some of the submissions of Cudler, for example, I use that as an example, they openly admit to leaving the town of Gawler and spending their time in Elizabeth and Manapara. It goes to your point of people using what's convenient. So when we make the statement, I'd really love to get down to the annual figure that actually equates to, given that our revenue isn't necessarily aligning with being a growth council.
Just one moment, just one moment.
Sorry?
Go for it.
Oh, sorry. So I can't quantify what the actual annual impact of what extra spend that we do in relation to accounting for the fact that potentially people that live outside of our council area using, you know, their impact on their roads, the use of our community facilities and all that sort of stuff. I can't quantify that because, yeah, I personally haven't done that work in relation to that. But again, you sort of sit there and say, okay, well, even if they don't necessarily, you know, and there might be swings and roundabouts in the sense that some people that are in our council area will go to Elizabeth or something like that, or even if they don't use our area, they might bypass through the town. So again, not in a position to quantify what that impact is from a budget perspective, but we do know that effectively with I suppose the population that's anticipated to be within the region, that there is going to be some impact. And whether it is effectively a dollar for dollar impact, but we do know that there will be more people probably using the roads and using our community facilities. So yeah, I can't answer that. So I can quantify essentially a revenue impact from us in the sense of saying, okay, from new development, based on our rating decisions and our rates, the rating decisions that are made in the past, based on a 2% growth, increase in number of assessments, the revenue growth is around about $500,000. So that's the extra revenue that we actually get. But the revenue targets of what you're actually seeing from a growth perspective ultimately depends on what your decisions are in rating. And I will sit there and say that it looks as though, and I don't know because I wasn't here, but effectively it looks as though, yes, you had a period, like you might have had really big growth, so you might have had periods of where you've had 4 or 5% growth through new assessments. It appears as though some of that revenue has actually been given back. So you've probably had less rate revenue increases than what you probably should have, because you're using some of that growth either from inorganic, from just property development, just general property growth and new assessment and new assessments, that's given that back. So that's probably why you're not seeing the revenue growth as to what you, and I don't know what you're expecting to see in that revenue growth. But that revenue growth is ultimately dependent on what your rating strategy. You know, so, but I could sit there and say out of the 23-24 budget, effectively $500,000 of that was from directly attributable to new assessments being within the council area. But I will also sit there and say what you actually did as well is to sit there and say you also from the, I suppose, our existing assessments, you actually gave a below CPI or below our increase in our cost base revenue increase. So that's actually, you know, that counteracts some of that revenue growth that you're actually delivering as well. So that's probably why you're not necessarily seeing that, because it is that thing of you should be taking growth and you should actually be making sure that your revenue increase is actually cognizant with what you're actually doing from a service delivery, either through an existing service delivery, the cost impacts, and the new initiatives that you're actually undertaking and delivering on. You know, so, and it is that, and you sort of sit there and say, okay, we're not seeing that impact. And I'll you know, as an example, from using last year's rating decision where you went with a 3% average rate revenue increase, where the recommendation from myself was around about 5. What we're actually talking about is to sit there and say then that the net impact of that is a couple of $1 million over that over this 3-year period. You know, so that's the other factor of you're not necessarily seeing that revenue growth figure is because of some of those revenues, not necessarily because we're not getting the growth, or we're getting the growth but we're actually giving it away, or we're not taking the full impact of that growth that we're actually getting. But we're still having to deliver services. We're still having to take on the assets, so we're still having to maintain the reserves and the roads, and you know we have new streets. You know, every single time we get a new road, we've got new public light. We've got extra public lighting that we have to pay for. We have street sweeping that we have to pay for. We've got, you know, reserves that we have to pay for. You know, so realistically, that's where you're actually getting and potentially that's where it's getting eroded going forward.
I've got a question.
Yep.
You talked about going back to basics.
Yep.
Can you explain that, please?
So going back to basics is just pretty much going back to making sure that we, from an asset management perspective, focusing on our asset renewals, focusing on, I suppose the basic infrastructure and the basic services that the community really expects councils to deliver on, you know, and it is that thing about not necessarily having a big program of new initiatives and new capital programs or capital expenditure outside of what's actually in the asset management plan, where the asset management plan focuses predominantly on that core community infrastructure. Yeah. So that's what it is, and keeping to sit there and say, okay, well, we've got our existing services, make sure that we're just doing that, and we're not, I suppose, detracting or not adding new things on, or that we can't, I suppose, deliver on within our existing resources. because at the moment we will sit there and say that there's probably been a situation where there's been a lot of things that said, yeah, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do that, but we can't actually do it within our existing resources. So we've actually had to get external resources in the sense of either consultants or contractors and all that sort of just come in to actually deliver on that. When we've probably got the expertise in-house to actually do it, there might be certain elements that we just need to do that peer review and that checks and balances from a legal perspective, but we just don't have that core, we don't have that capacity, I suppose, to utilise all the expertise that we actually have because we're actually spreading ourselves too thin.
Okay. So, Councillor Hennessy.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I really like the comment that you've said about we're going to have to manage community needs and expectations, and I think there has been a lot of, sure we'll do that, and sure we'll do this, and sure we'll do the other thing, and that we need to get a grip on it. I also like, Sharon, your definition of the growth, and I believe it is regional growth, but I think we've been using a non-specific, and while we can't do, as your answer to Councillor Shanks was, we can't yet put a dollar figure on it, I think there's an important piece of work that we do need to do where we sit down and come up with some specifics. And thinking back to the last 3 or 4 council meetings, we're dealing with them. We're dealing with increasing traffic, we're increasing need for parking in the main street, sporting facilities, health facilities, educational facilities, businesses suddenly coming up, like the enormous number of childcare. That's not just for the 43-acre, whatever size of Gawler, that's a regional response. So I think it would be an important piece of strategic work to start to deal with that, to list that, and then reach out to some of those organisations and get some statistics. And then once we've got that, then we can start possibly to put some dollar figures to it. But until we do that piece of work, we'll just keep using really broad things, which some in the community go, oh no, that's not right. People come in and the businesses benefit, so you should welcome people from the region using Gawler. We obviously do, but there are costs to council from our income. So I'd like to, I'm happy to be part of a group that do that. I'm very much aware that some of those organisations will share with us their statistical use of who within our area and who outside. Most of them absolutely exist because of the regional usage.
They do, and I know that Coles Gawler Central Shopping Centre, they gather postcodes, and most of their postcodes are north. They're north. They're not from south, they're north. And they all come here.
Sorry, and one last thing. I remember going to the community meeting for Hewitt, where we will put in a school, sporting facilities and businesses. There will be no need for the people of Hewitt to use the Gawler facilities.
Well, there's many people in Hewitt that are part of sporting clubs. That's... And look, Hewitt's actually part of Gawler, and that's my view, and that's my personal view, and they have every right to use Gawler facilities. They have every right to use Gawler's facilities because it's right next door. It's right next door. They're not going to go 30 kilometres to Kapunda or Freeling to enjoy the fruits of their labours. So it's right next door. So I think that's as it is. Deputy Mayor and then Councillor Solomon.
I'll just make a comment, and don't get me wrong, when I say about expanding, like managing and expanding that for Gawler growth, I'm not saying that we should be charging our existing ratepayers or our ratepayers in this town for that, meeting that expanding growth. I think it is that those questions that you need to have in relation to understanding that potentially, especially for our user pay services, there are people external to the town and external to the area that are using those services. So it's not as though you're actually, it's the people within the bounds of the town of Gawler that are actually paying those fees as well. So that's also that thing about, and I know it's always this bit of a question on the sense of, if we increase the cost to the pool and if we increase the cost of our services to the sports centre and all that sort of stuff. Yes, there are some people that are using it, and that are coming from the town, but there's also a lot of people in the town that are potentially not using it, that are actually subsidising the cost of that for other people to use as well. So those are the things that, when I say about that, I'm not necessarily sitting there saying, okay, well, we have to actually raise the revenue to meet that demand, but we have to be cognisant of when we're actually doing stuff and when we're planning for things that there will be that influence, and we need to actually work out how we actually, I suppose, charge for those community facilities that might be utilised by the wider... They're either utilised by the wider region or they're used for a specific cohort within the town. So those are the sorts of decisions that you need to make.
What's the subsidy that ratepayers pay? Because it used to be $5.25, but it's more than that now.
For the poor, is that?
It's more than $5.25.
I don't have those numbers, but I can present that sort of information unless David understands.
So through the chair, the last time we did the modelling, it was around about $8.60.
$8.60
per visit. Yep.
Per visit. So that's the subsidy that ratepayers are paying for people using the services of the town. Okay, $8.60.
Sorry, through the just for the aquatic centre, not for the whole town. That's the aquatic centre subsidy per visit. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, David. Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to go to... Oh, sorry, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I guess my question around is, around what role the council members have in the recurring budget, putting aside, what we set the rates at, but, because we've been talking about cuts by, reducing the amount of new capital, but there hasn't really been, because obviously that's, was it 2%, 3% or whatever of the budget, whereas the recurring's, the 97%, but there's not really much that we can say, a bulk of that staff expenses, that's not something that councillors can touch, that's the job of the CEO to make sure that's efficient. The road recurring stuff, is there anything in the recurring budget where councillors could be, saying, do we want to continue watering this park, or actually decisions about reduction in the recurring budget?
And I think that's basically the play. I don't, and that's a big exercise. From an administration perspective, we're actually doing that process as we speak. We are looking in this first cut of the recurrent budget. We've actually gone through and looked at areas of expenditure, and we've basically said, you've had a budget for the last 2 or 3 years, you haven't spent anything, it's gone, because effectively you're not necessarily delivering that service. And it's also some of those things about the fact of, we've said, we've got 5 or 6, 7 strategies or plan documents that we're supposed to be implementing, doing actions of it. We've actually said, we actually don't have the resources to actually implement actions across 5 or 6 or 10 plans in any given year. So what we're actually doing is to sit there and say, we're not going to put money in the budget for those sorts of things because we can't deliver on them. We can't deliver them because we don't have the resources to do it, or our existing resources are spread too thin, and if we actually want to do it, we have to engage someone else to do it, which is a bit of a misnomer as well, because you still need the internal resource to actually manage the person that's actually doing it, to tell them effectively what you want, which we actually spend just as much time telling them what they want for them us to charge us to tell us what we told them. So, so it's this catch-22. So we've sort of said, no, we need to cut it back. You know, so I suppose that's the role of the council, is understanding that we're trying to, you know, deliver everything that we like, as much value to the community based on our existing stuff that we've actually got in the plan. You know, so don't add. I suppose that's the key role, is to sit there and say, from a council perspective, is to sit there and say, and it's going back to, you know, the comment of managing expectations, managing community expectations, and it is. And I know it's hard for council members sometimes to say no to constituents, you know, but again, it may be that thing about to sit there and say, okay, well, you know, yes, you hear what they want, you put it in there, but effectively you can't guarantee that anything's going to happen within the next period of time, because we've got this, we're focusing on, this is our focus for the next 3 years, you know. So it is those sorts of things, without actually coming to every council meeting or committee meeting and asking for, you know, every report, every all that stuff that you actually ask, because a community member's asked, actually takes away council administration staff from actually potentially delivering on. And we as an administration feel this expectation that we have to deliver on all this stuff. We have to deliver, and the only way we can actually do that is actually to engage people to actually help us out. You know, so we get in this this spiral of just trying to spin our wheels, and we don't deliver anything. The community sits there and says, oh, we're not delivering anything, and you'll come back and sit there and say, oh, well, what's happening with here? And it's like, you know, so I suppose that's probably one thing that you could actually do as council members, to actually work with us to actually make sure that we're in a position to actually deliver and to demonstrate, yes, we are providing you value for money. We are providing the things that you want. We are addressing the potholes. We are addressing the footpaths. We are addressing, you know, we want to actually, you know, in high pedestrian areas, we want to make sure that there's always a paved footpath to actually create that pedestrian friendliness and, you know, cycle friendly, so you actually reduce the traffic congestion within the town, so you don't have to do a whole heap of infrastructure spend. You know, we want that as well, but we just can't deliver it, you know, at this point in time, because one, we don't have the financial capacity, but also it's actually, you know, from a resourcing capacity, some of it is actually far in excess of what we can actually do within our existing resources. And yes, we do know that we have to actually look at some services and to sit there and say, okay, well, you know, and it might be a service level for some areas of the recurrent operation that we are over servicing, or we have too high a level. But then there's the other thing about the fact of, yes, there's probably some efficiencies that we actually need to do. We need to look at the way we're doing it, you know, and to create some of those efficiencies. And there may be things that come back in the budgets, this budget or next budget, that you sort of sit there and say, oh, okay, well, you know, there's not a high visual impact of that, but the reason why we're presenting them is because we know it's actually going to create some efficiencies. It's going to be better utilisation of our in-house skills and resources, that we don't have to actually engage third parties to actually do work, because if we had some tools and better tools in-house, we could potentially deliver that. You know, there's an example, I think there's one piece of equipment, you know, that effectively, if we could just go buy it, we'd be better off, but at the moment we need it and we're hiring it. You know, there's this false sense of economy, but, you know, there's things from a chamber perspective is to sit there and say, oh no, well, you know, surely you can do without that for another year. Yes, we can, but there's a cost over here in our current budget that if we actually, you know, spent that money there, we could actually reduce, and you have a longer term benefit. So
I might go to Councillor Solomon. He had a question.
Thank you, Mayor. It was just, it's quite some minutes ago now, so I apologise. But there was a mention in there particularly about growth and in relation to growth contributing to the budget. I was just wondering about that point. Was it saying, I know last year we had a relative growth, I'm just going to pluck some figures out of the air, but say we originally had what would be an 8.5% rate increase, but then there was sort of enough growth that would look more like 6.5 because we'd had an increase in the number of ratepayers. It sounded, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is there a danger in automatically saying, oh, well, that will discount rates this year, and then not accounting for the additional funds that will be needed to go into maintaining service levels as the town grows, and if you do that across years? And was that what you were saying before, where there's potentially, we've done that across some years, and now we might face the consequences of that?
Didn't you say 2 million? Is that what you said, 2 million?
Yeah. So essentially that is I think, and I'll sit there and say that the rates and rate revenue, I suppose what the individual ratepayer pays in rates doesn't equate to your rate revenue increase, which is it's a confusing concept that a lot of people struggle to understand. So, and so I think that it is that rate revenue. So I will sit there and say, actually, I will recommend potentially a 8% rate revenue increase. And I know that of that 8% rate revenue increase, I know we're going to get a portion of that from growth from new assessments. So that, and it is that question, and I'm not necessarily sitting there saying, okay, well, if we can get an 8%, as long as our 8% still stays the same, whether it's from growth or mixes up from growth versus existing, I suppose, from existing ratepayer base, it's just that you don't want to actually reduce that rate revenue increase, which is what happened last year. You actually reduced your rate revenue increase by 1.5%. And that's actually now coming back, so that's what's created that thing. So it's a focus of whatever that rate revenue increase is, and then what that comes out is it depends on your increase in valuation, the number of new assessments and all that sort of stuff as an average increase and change in property value. So that's probably what it is. As long as you don't reduce that total rate revenue increase, it's fine. Or if you do want to reduce that total rate revenue increase, it's effectively what part of the expenditure budget you're actually going to reduce. Or if you want to actually do over and above new initiatives of increase in service levels and all that sort of stuff, maybe you have to think about having an additional 1% rate revenue to actually fund those new services, that increase in service level that we actually have. So
I'm going to go Paul Kosh. Have you got a question, Paul?
Yeah, thanks, mate. Now, Sharon, I just want to clear in my head. So you're proposing for this term, we just get back to basics, so just doing what we need to do. Then the next 4 years, next term is planning. Is that right?
No, so effectively from a delivery construction perspective, just basically focus on the basics.
Yes, that's what.
And for the next 3 years, and concurrently for that planning for, I suppose that detailed construction and design stuff for stuff that we're going to deliver in the next 4 years. I'm trying to think of something that would be an example, if Wendy or Andrew can help me out as to when we talked about.
Right. Okay,
and then planning for, so for example, an example is to sit there and say, and I'm preempting some stuff that's going to come back. So one of the new initiatives that we've actually put in for this year is actually to review and our recreation, a sporting and recreational plan. So what we're saying is to sit there and say, okay, so for the remainder of the council term, our focus is on effectively getting our planning right and our overall framework and our planning right for future construction of that, whether that's in the next council term or whether it's in the council term after and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
So that's what we're talking about for this remainder of this term. To then, I suppose, and then in doing that as well, focusing on some of that stuff of doing that structural repair to the recurrent budget, because realistically, if we don't get back to a operating surplus from our recurrent budget, we're just going to be chasing our tails, and that's what we need to do.
Right, I mean, okay, the next part of it is on this page here, you've got a list, Southern Sporting Precinct, Elliott Goodger redevelopment, pool development upgrade, Gawler Showgrounds, Carbeethan Reserve Stage 2. So they're all the different proposed projects. So we'll be planning those in the next 3 years, but then don't we need to work out which order they go? Because you could really only do one at a time, and then you do one, and you've got another gap, then you've got to do another one, you've got a gap, do another one. So I suppose what you're saying is we have to be realistic with the community about when those will come online if all things stay equal.
Yeah, so that's where we were saying about chunking it down,
yes.
You know, so yes, they're all the things that we're not proposing that they're all going to be done in the next, 8 years, but effectively they're just there as to sit there and say, okay, that's some of the stuff that's actually out there that we need to start, the reasoning why we're saying that effectively for the next 3 years, let's just go back to basics, let's start planning, let's understand, I suppose, our capacity to actually be able to deliver that, one from a human resource perspective, but also a financial capacity, and then going through that prioritisation and all that sort of stuff as well. So, okay,
it's also just looking at all those developments, there will be obviously a cost in doing master plans, doing consultation, doing detailed designs, everything else. So, are you suggesting that happens in this term as well?
No.
No.
So specifically, it's just planning for what we think that we can deliver for the next 4 years. So again, that's part of the long-term financial planning stuff as well, which will happen, concurrently as we go through. But realistically, because of the 24-25 budget forms that foundation, we probably need to make sure that we nail we understand and look at what we're doing for the 24 financial year, and then understanding what the impact of those decisions have on our future to work out when we've got the financial capacity to do some of these big strategic projects.
I wrote it down here, but I just want to clarify. So it's probably 7 years away before we dig a hole in the ground.
So
roughly.
I'm going to go to Andrew now. I'm going to go to Andrew. And then I'll go back to Councillor Solomon and then to Councillor Hennessy.
Thank you, Mayor. I was just reflecting on what Sharon was saying, and an example I'd probably give, looking at that sort of three-chunk or three-term process. We'll use Gawler East as an example. So at the moment we're revisiting the interventions. Those interventions are road traffic, they're also community infrastructure. So that deed and that process hasn't been revisited since 2017, so we're doing that now. So that will occur for probably largely the rest of this year, by which time we'll have some more accurate costings as to what we think the concept plan might be. And that will then lead to updated timing as to when we deliver. So we'll use the quarry as an example. That's where we think the community facilities would be. Realistically, we'd have trigger points, which would be somewhere around 2030, thereabouts. So the concept plan now, with some quantity surveying behind it, would then lead into detailed design probably in the next phase, not the current phase, but at least we've got the deed updated. And then we're waiting for the developer to do further development, which would we then trigger that investment. And then around 2029, 2030, 2031, you're actually doing the delivery potentially, or it might even go into the next term. But it's that 5 or 6 year time horizon, but that's realistically what it needs to be, given Gawler East, there's probably 6 or 8 road interventions. There's the 3 hectare open space parcel of land, for example. There's multi-purpose courts, there's some sort of bookable space as opposed to perhaps a community hub because it's more realistic based on the cost. So I think that sort of is an example on the ground of what Sharon was talking about.
So it's a long.
It's long term. It's long term. So I'm going to go back to Councillor Solomon now. Councillor Solomon.
Thank you. It was just in relation to population growth again. So I guess how do we factor in population growth such that, you know, when we get population growth over time, that's very hard to calculate the effect of that, as you said before. We're not having like the audit committee turn around and going, oh, actually this asset deteriorated a lot faster than we thought, and now we need to find an extra $500,000. How do we factor that in to make sure that we're maintaining the same service levels despite not being able to track population growth very accurately?
I think that's I suppose that's the criticality of obviously the work that we're doing this year with regard to the growth framework. You know, that growth framework is realistically that document that will, I suppose, guide some of this, because that will actually take into account what the anticipated population growth and the impact from all those other factors that need to take into account, and the integrated transport strategy. So those two, I think and they're probably an example of stuff that we actually need to do that planning for, in the sense, so we'll have the framework, and it will sort of start informing, those two documents will start informing some of this stuff in relation from a timing perspective, and then and concurrently with that, we actually need to work through to make sure that we can actually, I suppose, we have the financial capacity or we have that capacity to deliver on that when we need to deliver on it. And some of those things that we're going to have to deliver on it is going to happen before the growth, and some of them might happen while the growth is happening, and some might happen afterwards. But I think and that's probably one of the things without having that document, we are probably flying a bit blind at this point in time, would you say, Andrew? So I suppose those are the two things as well, and obviously potentially like the developer-led, the developer deeds and the interventions that are actually coming from that will also drive when potentially, you know, we do the timing of when we have to be ready for the Southern Sporting Precinct or, you know, the pool redevelopment and all that sort of stuff. So that's some of those sorts of things as well. So I think once we get that document, we'll probably be in a better position to sort of understand and future, I suppose, again, doing that future vision and future-proofing it, so we are in this capacity and making sure that we're not trying to do everything at once and being all things to all people. We just need to structure that as well. So, and in relation to that from a future perspective as well, we've also got impacts from, I suppose, state government and all that sort of stuff. For example, Main North Road, Williston streetscape upgrade, you know, where we have to work with, you know, DIT, because it's actually a DIT road. So, you know, and we want to do it all as one project. So, again, some of that sort of stuff as well. So if we can influence, I suppose, the timing of that as well with some of those third parties, because we actually understand where we've got capacity and where we've probably got a community need, we can actually be better equipped to do that as well. So it's just from that planning perspective.
Councillor Hennessy.
Yeah, Sharon, I very much understand that you said before that the whole rates revenue thing is complex, and I don't mean to force you to go through it in great detail, but I don't want to hear tomorrow in the media that the council staff are recommending an 8% rate amount going out. So could you just give a bit of a quick overview, perhaps, when you're talking about 8%, just what that actually means?
You've got a slide, haven't you,
Sharon? So that when I talk about rate revenue, increases, I'm talking about our bucket of rate revenue. I'm not talking what rates are increasing or anything like that. It's just basically how much our bucket of rates, which funds 80% of council operations, and unfortunately, because of where we are, we don't get a lot. We're in this in-between area. Like sometimes we're treated as metro, sometimes we're treated as rural, regional. from a grants perspective, from a recurrent perspective, we're treated as a metro. We're considered a metro council when the government's handing out federal funds. You know, from a roads to recovery perspective, we get the funding allocation as if we're a metro council. From financial assistance grants, we get our funding based on the fact that we're a metro council. Even though we probably aren't, you know, we've probably got some extra pressures because we're on that peri-urban area, but they treat us as so we don't have that opportunity. We don't have the area where some have big recurrent grant funding. We just don't do that. So, and then the balance of that is user fees and statutory charges, which again is such a small proportion of our budget. 80% does come from rate revenue, and it's that rate revenue bucket, how much that rate revenue bucket has to increase as a result of just cost pressures that are outside of our control, because like everyone else in the community, we are experiencing cost increases as well. And that's our only source of income. It's a property tax, and I know that the fact that, you know, people will pay more if their property value goes up, but we don't actually, we still sit there and say, this is the bucket of funds that we need. It will just potentially get distributed differently every year. Some people, one ratepayer might go down one year and then up the next year, vice versa. It just depends on that. I don't have those answers, and I won't have those answers until we determine what our budget is, and we actually get the information, the property information from the Valuer Generals, because we don't determine the property values either. The Valuer General does that. So we're given that, and that pretty much is what all these discussions that we're having over the next month or so. I won't, the actual determination of what it means for an increase in the amount of rates payable by the individual ratepayer cannot be determined. That's the last piece in the pie. I'm not, yeah.
So you have to determine your rates. You have to determine your budget before you...
Yep, you have to determine your budget. You have to determine what you want to deliver on it.
You have to do that first.
Yep. And if you don't want to increase your rates, you have to work out what you're not going to deliver. It's quite as simple as, you know, that. It's one, you know, ideally we'd like the pendulum balanced, but
Paul,
what?
You had a question? Yeah.
I'm not sure if it still occurs, but when we did the dog park, Light Council said they were going to contribute. Did they, and they still do?
How much do they contribute?
I mean, that's a good model, I would have thought.
How much?
You know, for other councils, you know, where their residents are using our services potentially.
They don't actually pay that much, do they? No. Is it under 10 or is it over 10?
Yeah, through the it is the model. They do contribute, and it is a percentage of the overall maintenance cost to the park. I won't go into whether I think it's fair or not, but I will expand on that point and say that we've got many, many users who use our facilities that council operates and maintains, and many, many of those users pay almost nothing towards the ongoing operations and maintenance. And I think, again, that's something that we might have to have a brave conversation about.
Yeah, I just want to point out the model, that was all.
Deputy Mayor.
So I guess my first question's around, so you mentioned grants before. Is that something that is more, being more targeted in our grants, something that we're looking at? I'm just thinking about, obviously we have a few key projects that we'd like to do. Are we going to be targeting more specifically at, when it comes to grants that, you know, we have to pay 50-50, except more specifically on targeting just those specific projects, for example?
I'll start off and then I'll hand over to Wendy. So obviously from a recurrent perspective, there's very few grants that will fund effectively what they would call recurrent operations, which is basically salaries or administration staff and all that sort of stuff. We've got In addition to the financial assistance grants, we've got 2 or 3 grant-funded services, right, or partially grant-funded from our recurrent operations, you know. So from a general recurrent perspective, the opportunity to increase the grant stuff is just not necessarily there unless the state government basically wants to shift the delivery of that service to council. But essentially what is tending to happen in from a state government perspective is that they're tending to shift those sorts of things out to the private sector rather than from a council perspective. And obviously if we do additional services, effectively then we're going to have to fund that ourselves anyway. So, or overall our net position isn't going to improve because we're going to incur additional costs. From a projects perspective, I would sit there and say, you know, once we actually develop our plan and work out what are the key projects that we actually want to do, I would sit there and say I would highly recommend that our focus on grants should be, wherever possible, to deliver existing projects. And if there is a future project of something that's maybe 2 or 3 years down the track and we decide to bring forward, we have to push something out, you know. So we can't necessarily say that we're going to do project X and funding is coming available for us to do project Y and project Y wasn't planned to do for another 2 years. If we want to go for that grant funding to do project Y, we're doing project Y and we're pushing back project X. Because the days, you know, obviously, unless, and I won't wish this upon anyone, unless we go through another pandemic, the days of 100% funded grant funding is gone, and there will always be a council contribution to it. So yes, so I would sit there and say, but I know Wendy had a...
Thank you through you, Chair, and I think Sharon, really, you've said most of it all very succinctly. I think acknowledging how grateful we are for all the grant funding we have received recently is important. I mean, the community is definitely going to benefit massively through what we have received. I think from a strategic delivery perspective, in a financially constrained environment with a whole suite of expectations from so many different user groups, this focus on getting the planning right is the key. You know, in infrastructure, you know, the saying is, I can do anything with time and money. You know, money is constrained, but again, if you plan it out and be strategic in the prioritisation of what you need to deliver and align that and recalibrate that with what your budget position is over not just a 5 or 8 year, we're really looking probably a 15 to 20 year horizon for the types of huge amount of investment there's up there. If you've got your planning right, you can actually get your money right, and that's where the grant readiness comes in, and there's a nimbleness. I don't think that's actually a word, but I don't know what the right word, but you know, a flexibility that you can incorporate into that plan. So, like Sharon said, you've strategized it out, so you're doing A, B, and C, but the grant funding for C comes up before B, and you can be nimble and switch those around. But again, you're switching them around while managing the expectations because your community's been involved to understand why the staging is what it is. It really is about having a feasible staging plan over that, you know, multi-term horizon, and understanding not just your grant funding, but I guess all the other funding models that might sit in and around it. And I'm going to go from, it's not just about time and money. You can do anything if you've got a really good plan. So investing in that is why you're going to hear us harp on about that, because that plan is what is going to set all of us, for our community, up to succeed.
And I'll just add to that as well, yes, good planning and good discipline. You know, it is that discipline on the sense of saying, you know, it's not that the plan is set in stone, but it is that discipline to sit there and say, okay, there might be some opportunity, but having that discipline to sit there and say, is that opportunity right for us at this point in time? rather than saying, oh, okay, well, we'll just get this because it's there. You know, we can't pass up this opportunity. Sometimes it might actually be good business to actually pass up that opportunity. And that's where I say about the discipline from that perspective as well. So, yeah, so it's a combination of having a plan. I suppose not so much, I suppose it's having that roadmap, you know, having a roadmap, breaking that roadmap down into, I suppose, plans in deliverable stages, and that's where we think 4 years is probably that deliverable time frame, and making sure that effectively we have that discipline and that planning process in what we're doing when we're coming up to decisions and all that sort of stuff. And potentially from an administration perspective, we may be recommending stuff that you not do things, you know, and we don't do that lightly. You know, we do that in the context of everything, in the sense of when we potentially not recommending that we go down a particular path. There is, you know, normally there is a there is a justification for why we've actually come for that recommendation. And we acknowledge as well that we probably need to get better at communicating and putting that information into council reports, you know, putting in from a financial and budget implications, making sure that effectively demonstrating what this means for future rather than just what it means for today. You know, so we acknowledge that we need to do some work with our managers and our leaders and those people that are actually doing that and changing their mindset as well. You know, I would sit there and say that Wendy and I have probably had a couple of frustrating conversations, just trying to get people to change that mindset, to sit there and say, okay, well, yes, we might have done it that way in the past, but we just need to change something. So we're trying to change that mindset and that approach as well. From that perspective, just trying something trying the same thing but doing it a different way, you know.
I think the discipline is going to be really, really important, and a roadmap is also going to be really, really important over a 20-year period. And discipline, we need to be disciplined, and we need to listen to the professional staff, and you need to get better at communicating. Because you haven't been communicating with us, and so I think that the only way is up. The only way is up.
Yeah, and I agree with that. You know, there might be a, you know, and I know that there's always this, you know, we'll take the pure business approach to it, whereas potentially, you know, and you've got the political overlay, and sometimes we sort of fall into that, well, we know that this might be right from a business perspective, but we know that political overlay will potentially change that. So we might not communicate what we actually need to communicate. And you're right, we need to change that position from that perspective as well, and being upfront. And we know that potentially that there's going to be some decisions that you'll sit there and say, yep, we hear what you say, but we're still going to go down this path, and that's fine. But we just need to make sure that we communicate what that implications are, because I suppose there's always consequences for every decision we make, and we always have choices in life. So we just have to be clear that we actually understand and collectively understand what those implications are, either from a risk perspective or a financial perspective, or a community expectations and community needs perspective as well. So,
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I definitely think the discipline, but also the flexibility that will come with having a more detailed plan on things in terms of, you know, for example, the aquatic centre, rather than just having a big, whenever we get, you know, $30 million for the aquatic centre, having we could do the small pool at some point, and that could be 5 years separated from doing the big pool, you know, because that's the opportunity that comes up. But that's only possible if we have the planning documents in place, I guess, to be able to pitch that. So I guess that's where the flexibility comes in, is in having the plans. But yeah, look, I think I think there has been a general, I mean, obviously the last budget cycle was, controversial in a few ways, but I think generally a lot of people were on the same page in terms of the operating expenditure. There was a pretty, some vicious cutting from the council members when it came to the operating expenditure. It took the already limited staff suggested changes and we cut over $1 million or something like that. But then there was the communication issues around the, how the rates work and all that kind of thing. But I think generally people have been on the same page, but it is the communication and mutual understanding of what actually we are discussing that I think is the part that was missing last time, not the want from council members to be part of a disciplined budget cycle.
Councillor Shanks?
I don't agree. I think there's an appetite to be disciplined if we know what we're being disciplined for. With all due respect, we've had a long-term financial plan that has now run its course that we're about to update, and some of the key projects that we were hoping to deliver or have been delivered and haven't quite been fully realised, and some of those things we're trying to mop up, I guess, in community expectations versus return on investments is something we're all collectively working through. But all of that aside, the mapping the strategies, et cetera, is an appetite that I think as a council we're showing. I mean, the working group doesn't exist on sporting infrastructure upgrade because we don't want to figure out what the wants and needs are of those clubs. But all that aside, when we do talk about, possible revenue streams, I did have a question about the swimming pool, and I'm sorry to circle back, but the old dump model, if you don't live inside the council area, you show your licence, you actually have to pay X amount more than what the person that lives in the area. Do we do that with the swimming pool? Do we charge?
No.
So
no, it's the same.
We do in the cemetery,
yeah.
Because I mean, to me that just seems like a no-brainer on a conversation of we want to tax the people that come in and use our services. Well, that user charge is one of those ones that we do.
Our pool is one of the cheapest pools around, and Natalie Johnston, who's the chair of the audit committee, she said your pool is really cheap. Really, really cheap. And I know why that is, because we have people that need to use the pool. However, we need to be disciplined and make some hard decisions. And that might be that opportunity. Again, this is the team that you're calling for, of brainstorming ideas to see where those revenue streams are on user charges. I mean, to me personally, looking at what that looks like, of charging our ratepayers $8 or whatever it is at this point in time, and charging our non-ratepayers $16, I think ticks a lot of boxes on some sentiment of people coming in and using our services. Well, some people will say, I live in Gawler.
And we manage that expectation because factually, unfortunately, borders have to start and stop. If you don't have the right licence that shows you live in Gawler, that doesn't, you move to Gawler so you can pay half the fund. That's all good. Who knows, you might even have some Hewitt residents looking for boundary reform. But anyway, putting that aside, those sorts of things, when we've got a business like a swimming pool that is copping that much loss, not isolated to our council area. I talked to Barossa Council a couple of weeks ago. They've got 5 swimming pools that they manage that are copping losses in these sorts of figures. But anyway.
Pools, look, our pool is a much loved facility.
Definitely.
We've got lots of people swimming up and down and doing laps and playing and enjoying the water and getting strong in the water. And I think and I know that the aquatic centre won an award last year for their first class service. and their vacation swimming classes, their all of those paid services, that people love that. They love it, and it is a much loved facility, but it is getting old. It's 60 years old now. It was built in 62, and it's getting old. So there is an opportunity to over time to redevelop that pool, get rid of the deep end, get rid of the deep end, because we don't need the deep end anymore. We don't need it. We used to have a diving school. And that's why we had the deep end. But we don't need it anymore. So, Councillor Hennessy.
Yeah, I'm happy to look at those user pays charges. I just need to put in though. There's really only two: the rec centre and the pool that is user. So if we're going to do that, and again stress, I've got no problem in doing that differentiation. I'd like to look at all the fees charged across everything. So how much do we charge businesses for parking bays? How much do we charge for planning applications? How much? So, if we're going to be serious about upping charges, let's look across the whole state, because don't go to the too easy and the too soft ones, I think. And bear in mind that if we raise it, we have competition in the town. We do have another swimming pool. We've got to bear that in mind as well. So happy to look at it, and I think it is time to do exactly that. But it's not a blunt instrument, and I think those two areas are easy targets.
They are.
So I'm just mindful of that.
Yeah, they are easy targets, and because they lose money. However, you're absolutely right, Councillor Hennessy. They're community services. However, it is important to look right across all user charges. Councillor Solomon?
Sorry, I was just going to add no ill will to anyone, but I think we're starting to stray maybe into some of that deliberative function of council that we're not supposed to be doing, and I'm aware we have more than half a presentation left, so I might just add that.
Thanks, Isaac. I'll just add one thing in relation to that fees and charges as well, is that, and our facilities, and I suppose it is that going back to sit there and say, going back and thinking about what's that regional demand. Is the outdoor swimming centre here in Gawler a regional facility? And should we be promoting it like a regional facility as well? So it's not, I probably concur with Councillor Hennessy, is to sit there and say, I think a lot of time, like if you want to start introducing some of that thing of differentiating between residents and non-residents for user charges and community facilities and the use of community facilities, we do need to expand it beyond just, I suppose, those easy things. But you also need to understand. We also need to have that understanding of why are we providing that service as well? Why are we providing that facility? Are we providing that facility to actually make sure that we're providing a destination for the youth of the region? Same with the sports centre and all that sort of stuff as well. So it's not just necessarily okay, well, you're not paying for this service, or you're not paying, the remainder of the community is subsidising you to come in and do that. So it is just something, it's part of a wider position as well.
A lot of older people use the swimming pool as well.
Yeah,
so that's what I'm saying.
It's
not just youth.
Yeah, well, no, but that's what I'm saying. Like, we need to understand why we're providing it, and are we providing it as a regional facility versus a town facility? That's all my comment.
Brian.
Thank you, Mayor Karen. To Sharon. But I think I've said it many, many times. How do we know who the people are that use these facilities? Whether it's the pool, whether it's the rec centre, whether it's the library at Everson Park, or whatever it may be. Because unless we know their postcodes, I think somebody said something before about postcodes, and I've just been all around Victoria to Speedway and that, and everywhere I went, I said, may I have a receipt? And I didn't have a clue when I went to the potato van who they were. She said, yeah, no worries, we'll send it to you. When I got home, I had all these receipts on my email. So the system in the world has changed. When people pay by email, you know where they come from.
No, you don't. You know their email address.
So, but how do we know who uses it? Because everything you've just said is very, very relevant. But unless we know where they come from, we can't say it's regional or local.
It's going to be quite difficult. It's going to be really, really difficult because people will come and pay their money and they won't think about where their postcode is. They won't know, and they'll want to come to the pool, and it is a regional facility. It's the only 50-metre swimming pool north. Well, Playford's got a swimming pool, a 50-metre swimming pool. We've got a 50-metre.
It's probably the only outdoor one for what region, but anyway, there are means and ways that we can collect that, and I think that's part of that. Whatever service or whatever thing that you're talking about, you just don't want to just make a knee-jerk reaction. We need to actually make sure it's an informed decision as well. So I'm just conscious of time, so I'll move on. So again, the idea of this first part of the presentation was just sort of to set the scenes as to sit there and say, okay, well, this is our thinking and this is our approach and this is how we've are approaching the 24-25 budget. You know, so we're talking about recurrent, and we've actually looked through that. So we've even applied this philosophy of what can we do now, what do we need to plan for, how can we actually make sure that we better utilise our resources. I won't go through this. So effectively in January we set a couple of, I suppose, small objectives that effectively should also drive some of the decisions and some of that planning that we've got for the next 12 months, you know, if it is that. And again, it's that probably the biggest goal out of this for our annual business plan, I think it is that goal 5 and that leadership stuff about making sure that the budget that we develop is actually a robust budget, so it actually positions ourselves to actually really have that focus on reducing our operating deficit, making sure that we actually create some financial capacity within this to reduce our reliance on debt. Because if we don't do it this year, you'll be listening to me say exactly the same thing next year and the next year after. So, you know, because it is, you know, I can't stress the criticalness of it. You know, and I don't know what the answer is. You know, I will sit there and say, you know, I had a discussion with the auditors, the external auditors yesterday, and they were talking about, and they're going, well, how do you feel about it? You know, from my perspective, it is a very daunting task that I don't know the answer. I don't know what the silver bullet is. But effectively, it's to sit there and say, but there needs a point in time where we have to stop, we have to think about it, and we have to actually face that reality. And the 23-24 budget is that reality from my perspective. So just to finish off, so in relation to, so we've got the draft recurrent budget, so it's actually based on what you'll see the figures, it's based on a 7% rate revenue increase. That takes into account around about a 2% increase of revenue from new assessments. So that's an unknown. We know that potentially that relies on the developers that are actually in the town actually making new assessments. In relation to user charges, there is an increase in user charges. So it is proposed, and it will be presented as a new fee, and fee is actually to introduce a spectator fee. So currently spectators come in and say, oh, I'm just watching, don't pay anything, go to the bath, go to the change rooms, put on their swimming bathers and jump in the pool. So, so it is...
They do.
It is, and every other pool has a spectator fee. So there is a proposed spectator fee, which is predominantly one of the increases. In relation to the program fees at the swimming centre and the sports centre have actually been reviewed. So there is that increase. That is obviously dependent on the fees, the new fee being introduced. Statutory fees, so I suppose I heard someone talking about what we charge for planning, assessments and all that sort of stuff. We're constrained with what we charge. They're legislated fees. So we have to charge what the legislation sets. We don't know what those increases, if there are any increases in those fees, we won't know that until the state government hands down their budget in June. We might get a bit of precursor leading up to that where they leak all the things about what's actually happening, but pretty much what we've actually done is to sit there and say some that we know that legislation sort of embeds a CPI increase, we've increased them by CPI, or otherwise we've kept them stagnant. So there might be a bit of uplift there, but we just don't know. And unfortunately, from a timing perspective, the state government fees delivery of that is... doesn't actually help us because it's so late in the budget process. Helen, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm just going to flag, given that you've put a general increase in admission and program fees at the swimming centre and the sports centre, may I suggest that we look at the higher, what's the policy, that we've just been looking at, the higher of council facilities, because I think it might be time, in reflection of the increase, that we look at who is getting significant rebates for using all of those facilities, and I think the two need to be considered in one, because once you've been granted a rebate, it then seems to shield you forevermore from increases, and I think we need to bear the two in mind, because I think there's a possibility that we're creating a strong inequity by our higher council facilities. I just flag it.
I think that there's been just a general increase in all fees from that perspective. So, in relation to grants, subsidies and contributions, the budget is based on the fact that the assumption that we'll receive for financial assistance grants. That's on the premise that the federal government will continue advancing. I think that they've got themselves into a position with their 100% advance from last year that they have to do that. I don't think that the economy's recovered enough, or that there's enough in the system not to advance that payment. And the other is supplementary road funding for SA, because we maintain more roads than what our population is. Home assist and library grants. So we don't actually have a lot of grant income. Roads to recovery funding has to be treated as an operating income, but we actually use that to fund a capital road project. So from a recurrent budget perspective, I propose that actually gets treated as an operating initiative as part of that operating initiative's budget. So we don't sort of not increase rates because we think we've got income to fund our recurrent operations, when we actually don't, because we actually use that to fund our help fund our capital program. Employee expenses, our current enterprise agreements expire on the June this year, so we're currently negotiating with the budget preparation. So we've put an estimate in. We don't know what that increase is at, we don't know what the staff proposal is yet, but we will be cognizant of that in relation to, I suppose, our budget constraints as well when we put our offer on the table from a organisation's perspective. Superannuation guarantees increasing again to 11.5%. It's got another increase to 12%, and then hopefully it sort of stays at that level for a while. And we have incorporated a savings target of $275,000 into the overall employee expenses. Just in relation to that savings target of 275, we normally build that in because we know effectively people, you know, while it's a great place to work, people do sometimes leave us, and it takes time to actually fill those positions. A good thing from a delivery perspective and an establishment perspective is that pretty much we've got nearly all our established positions filled. You know, over the last few years post-COVID, we've had quite substantial vacancies that we haven't been in a position to fill. I think Andrew's probably happy now that he's had 3 planning staff start in the last 3 weeks. So most of the areas are pretty much at full complement. So potentially that savings target of 275 might be a challenge, especially if we may be able to retain staff as well and not have the vacancies or the turnover. But we'll sit there and say, okay, well, on a standard year, we have about between a 7 and a 10% turnover, so we still expect that to happen. From a materials and contracts perspective, some of those cyclical expenses and what we would determine as essentially projects because they're linked to the delivery of an action in one of our plans that potentially is not part of the normal operations. We've actually, in the recurrent budget over the past few years, we've had money buckets in there. That effectively we said, oh, well, we have to do this, but because we haven't had resources, we're actually haven't been able to deliver that. So we've sort of taken those sorts of things out and having a bit more structured approach to those to sit there and say, okay, as I said, what's our focus this year and what part of the plans and what are the projects under the plans that are we actually going to deliver or try and deliver and do specific one-off type projects, because that's normally what they are. They're normally one-off projects of implementing something. So we'll treat those things as part of the initiative budget if we put that forward. And again, we've built in a savings target of $475,000 into this budget. So that pretty much takes into account the fact that one of it in the sense of we had a target from 23-24 of 283,000, so we have to maintain that savings. And then because of the position from an employee perspective, we did have an over and above EA increase for the 23-24 financial year. However, so we budgeted for 6.5. Based on the EA, we ended up having to pay 8%. So what we've actually said is that because we've got the full complement of staff, we won't be able to deliver that, maintain that savings in employee expenses. So we've actually shifted that to sit there and say, okay, well, we have to get more efficient and try and utilise our employees so we don't have to actually outsource stuff. So what that all means is that pretty much, the next one is the draft budget at this point in time, having in mind the fact that of the audit committee's expectation or recommendation that we deliver an operating surplus for the 23-24 year. There still needs to be some work done on the draft budget. You know, as administration and the executive team, we know that we actually have to do a bit more. Again, it's the thing of spending the time and identifying those areas where we actually probably just need to put a bit of refocus, a bit more focus on and a bit more rigour with regard to interrogating staff. So we do expect that we'll probably come back with once the final and the combined budget is actually put together, that there will actually probably be some more work done on this. From a revenue side perspective, there's probably not much level to move. Again, the long-term financial plan was based on a 6% revenue increase plus 2.1% growth. This is on 7%, so that's where the major fall or variation to the long-term financial plan is. From an expense perspective, as I said, we've built in, we've had that higher than average increase from last year, which we're actually getting that full year impact because we actually had, we delivered on savings because we actually didn't have, we withheld vacant positions, recruiting of vacant positions, because we knew that we had this extra pressure on meeting that salaries budget that we actually adopted last year. We've got the full year impact of that this year. So because we've got that full complement, we don't have that ability to actually use those vacancies that currently exist and that we or exist at 1st of July to actually defer them. In relation to the materials and contracts, that's where you'll see that there's been a big reduction. Obviously, that's one of the reasons for that is that we've actually incorporated that savings target of 475,000. And as I said before, we've actually been quite, when people have come back and made their budget submissions, we've actually gone back and worked out what's actually happened over the last 2 or 3 years on particular areas, and we've actually gone back to them and sit there and say, okay, well, you haven't spent this budget for the last 2 or 3 years. Why do you think you're going to spend it this year? And if they've said, I don't know, we just think we are, we've just said, okay, well, no, you know, we're just not going to put it in the budget and all that sort of stuff, but unless they can actually justify that there's something substantiating or something that they're doing to actually have that. Finance costs. So finance cost is a big area. So there was a paper that was presented to the audit committee recommending that we take advantage of the fact that the predictions of interest rates falling, so we actually fix a component of our current debt, so we actually reduce that interest impact, because effectively at the current rate the fixed rates are around about 1% lower than the variable rates. So we realistically have to have probably about 4 or 5 rate increases of around 25 basis points in the next 2 years to actually, I suppose, be impacted. I don't know what's happening with interest rates. If you hear some people say that there's going to be a cut in September, some sit there and say that they're going to be in January next year, some say that they're not happening until December 25, you know, so it's all a bit of a pie in the sky, but I think that realistically we need to actually minimise some of that impact of, and actually I have also heard some commentators sit there and say that potentially there may still be an increase in the cash rate because of what's actually happening overseas as well. So just to minimise some of that impact, it's proposed to actually fix a component of our debt to minimise those increases. And depreciation is just basically a past expense, but gifted assets is the big unknown. So from a recurrent budget perspective, so this doesn't include any initiatives, just want to make sure that so on top of this number, any initiatives that we do is going to increase that operating deficit. All right. So this is just the recurrent budget, long-term financial plan, recurrent budget versus the draft budget. So at the moment we're about $200,000 behind on the long-term financial plan, but we're probably still, over the next 2 years, we probably still need to find another, you know, $2.5 million as well. So as I say, it's a daunting task that I don't know the answer to. As I said, initiatives budget and any new FTEs, that we actually add will increase the operating deficit. Capital expenditure and initiatives budget will increase borrowings because we are dependent on our overdraft. Current position in line with the long-term financial plan target, we won't achieve the Audit and Risk Committee's target of returning to operating position by 25-26. But I think we need to give it a crack. So we need to make sure that effectively we try and minimise that deficit that we're actually getting from our recurrent operations, and also really think about what initiatives that we're actually doing, our operating initiatives, what we actually need to do, what's in the plan, what's essential, what's critical for, I suppose, what's critical to actually deliver on now, or what's critical to actually create future efficiencies that we can actually make sure that we can position ourselves to actually deliver an operating surplus. Because we really do need to be in a position to start repaying debt, and we actually really need to make sure that we can work towards funding our operating expenditure from our own cash, and effectively our borrowing should actually only be used to fund new capital long-term assets. Obviously, there's two levers that we have. We've got to increase revenues, reduce operating expenses. Realistically, that's it. There's nothing else. Major lever from a revenue perspective, unfortunately, is rate revenue. Yes, we can look at our unit charges for our user charges and all that sort of stuff. However, unless you're really prepared to make some really hard decisions in the sense of start charging for facilities that we have never charged for before, the uplift in changing our user charges is actually going to be quite minimal. It's around the edges, but potentially having that hard decision about charging people what the true cost of maintaining the facilities that people or specific groups are actually using will potentially have a bigger impact than working out whether we charge $8 or $8.50 to go into the pool, or I don't know how much it costs to go skating, $10 versus $12, I don't know. So those are the things. Unless you're prepared to actually touch some of those, I think what I would call potentially sacred cows in council land, because it's across all councils. There's a couple of sacred cows that people just don't want to touch. Unless you're prepared to do that, realistically, it's rate revenue. Or your reduction in your operating expenses, and that's basically looking at your service levels or your service offerings. And again, your new initiatives. So realistically, that's where we're at. Again, just probably want to reiterate some stuff that I presented back in November about really applying that financial discipline if we don't actually have that commitment to achieving that operating surplus and being financially sustainable. I don't know what the answer is, but realistically we do need to do that fiscal, so once we bet on it, once we apply, determine what the budget is, we really need to be strong about asking for new things. And even if it is just asking for a report or asking for an investigation or asking a review of something, while it might not necessarily have a direct external cost, it does have an implicit cost, because the implicit cost is what aren't staff doing because they're focusing on this, and delivery of that.
So with that, I'd really like the executive team to tell us, if there's a report that an elected member wants, tell us what you won't be doing and what you will be doing. Tell us. Communicate with us. You know, so you need to bring your communication skills right in the middle here. You know, and all of you need to do that. Even you, Andrew, David, Wendy, you must tell us if there's a report that an elected member wants and you don't think you can deliver on it, you tell us. Yeah, that's right. So what will be given up to enable that report to be done? And that's really, really important communication skills.
And I'll put the challenge out there is to sit there and say, okay, we've got the framework and got the objectives, and making sure that the request is within the frames of, I suppose, the framework that we established as part of what we're actually doing for the budget as well, or for the next 12 months, you know, or once we finalise the long-term financial plan within that framework as well. So yeah. And obviously, if we have overruns, we need to be strong, again, in the sense of some, you know, from a staffing perspective, is to sit there and say, having those conversations and being quite strong with staff, and also to sit there and communicate, to sit there and say, oh, actually, we've gone over here, we're not doing this, we can't do this, or we have to do it a different way. And again, and I think that this is a really big one, no new capital projects, no new capital expenditure unless it's potentially matched. You know, obviously it's got a funding element, and if you want to do the new capital expenditure, or you want to present the new capital expenditure, what aren't we doing? What are we deferring as a result of that new capital expenditure? We need to, as I said, we need to probably get back to basics and focus on those core and essential services. Consider those, I suppose, those other revenue opportunities, rather to reduce our reliance on rates, you know. And it is some of that stuff about as well, you know, even the implicit stuff about, you know, what can we do from an economic development perspective so you get that external investment, so you might actually get some private investment in some of that stuff, so the reliance on us providing some of those basic services may not be there as well, because someone will come in and deliver those services. Again, whether it is a levy for potential future investment, strategic investment, you know, is the extent of the investment required? You know, do we need to actually introduce a levy for specific projects? And again, going back to Cody's questions, being disciplined when we're pursuing grant funding opportunities. Only pursue those opportunities where we actually haven't, you know, it is meeting an expenditure need, it's reducing the cost of council, not actually increasing the cost of council. And again, reprioritise and don't add, you know. We've also changed from an administration and an executive perspective, the approach of, you know, how we're going to present the projects to you. We're going to probably present them to you in a priority perspective, to sit there and say, okay, well, which takes into account the fact of, you know, from a risks perspective, whether it's a part of a plan perspective, whether it's a legislative requirement and all that sort of stuff, to sit there and say, okay, well, these are the things that from a high priority perspective, which we consider, you know, in that wider framework that I've presented tonight, that we consider are essential. You know, and the ones that we, you know, operationally we do not consider essential. From that perspective as well. So yeah. And that's it. If anyone has any questions.
Thanks. Sharon, just a quick one about the Roads to Recovery funding. Just, can you explain, I know we went over it in the debrief. But can you explain a little bit what happened there? And that looks a little bit dodgy. I guess what's the role as well of the audit committee in picking up on some of those things? Looks like we've misused the grant.
It's not dodgy.
We might send that through in an email.
It's probably easier for me to explain in verbal, like do an initial response, and then I'll follow it up probably in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
Just in response to, so from a roads to recover, from a federal government perspective, the federal government works on cash. You know, we work on accrual accounting, we match revenue and expenses and all that sort of stuff. It all goes back to accounting standards, where accounting standards from a grants perspective is that we have to receipt it as revenue, and because it's not tied, so even though we have to use it on a road project, the government doesn't, like with other grants, they don't actually specify whether it's a capital project or it's maintenance. So we can actually also use that to do just general maintenance. What happens, and so by virtue of that, we have to actually have it as operating revenue. But what most councils do is to sit there and say, but it has to be for a road or a road-related project. And because most of those road-related projects are in the capital program, in the sense of a renewal project or an upgrade project or something like that, most councils actually use it as funding for a capital project. The reason why I say that we actually extract it from the recurrent budget is because of that thing of thinking that, oh, okay, well, I've got an extra $300,000 of grant income that I can use to fund recurrent operations, so I don't have, my bucket of rate revenue doesn't have to be as big as what I would first thought. But then that money gets directed over here. So that's the way it is. It's not dodgy. It's just I don't agree with the treatment of it. It's just basically that's how we have to treat it. And I've had multiple arguments with auditors, and you know the general matching principle and the basis of what accounting is on, it flies in it. So yeah. But I will explain it in a bit more technical manner in an email. Just before I finish up, again, if anyone wants to have a discussion about the budget, if they don't understand something, if they want to have an offline discussion, feel free to actually give me a call. I'm more than happy to spend an hour or two going through. If you want another, you know, if you want a bit more in-depth one-on-one conversation about how rates work and all that, or just generally how the components of the budget come together and all that sort of stuff, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to do that, you know, whether it's an hour or two, whether it's after hours and all that sort of stuff. I'd much rather you come to me and have those discussions rather than you're sitting there thinking, I just don't understand what she's talking about, you know, and I don't know what the decision is that I should be making or what I should be supporting or what I shouldn't be supporting. Yeah, so really, if you feel as though you need to have a bit more of a discussion, either give me a call, more than happy to, again, meet up with a group of you and run a Finance 101 session with you from that perspective. So other than that, I've got nothing more to say.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, executive team. I think we'll call it quits for the night. It's 9:10, and I think we all should go home and put our feet up. And if you do need to contact Sharon or any of the executive team about any question, please contact them. Please pick up the phone. You've all got the mobile numbers, and please contact the executive team, or even go through the CEO, acting CEO. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.